The last winter of the Reich arrived not with silence, but with exhaustion. By the final days of December 1944, the German war machine was bleeding from every artery. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's final gamble in the West, had frozen in the snows of Belgium, its armour stranded, its infantry retreating under skies filled with Allied bombers. Yet in the ruined headquarters outside Berlin, one final idea flickered like the last flame in a dying engine. Operation Bodenplatte. It would be the Luftwaffe's last strike, a single massive blow to reclaim the sky. Every fighter that could still fly, every pilot who could still climb into a cockpit, would rise together on New Year's morning and fall like thunder upon the airfields of Belgium, Holland, and northern France. The goal was simple and desperate: destroy the Allied air forces on the ground, burn their aircraft before they could take off, and buy Germany a few more weeks of life. But in the planning rooms, there lingered an unspoken truth. The Luftwaffe that had once ruled Europe, that had blackened London's sky in 1940, that had swept across Poland, France, and the Balkans, no longer existed. Its veterans were dead or scattered, its training schools reduced to chaos. The new pilots were children of the ruins, boys with pale faces and trembling hands, trained in weeks instead of months, taught only to take off, aim, and die quickly. Still, orders came. At the stroke of midnight on December 31st, 1944, as artillery flashed along the frozen front, Luftwaffe ground crews worked by lantern light. They brushed frost from canopies, filled tanks with precious fuel, and painted black crosses over bullet-scarred fuselages. The air smelled of oil and defeat. Somewhere, a radio played the last bars of a waltz before fading into static. In the distance, Allied flares rose over the Ardennes like false stars. And in the darkness beyond, hundreds of German fighters waited for dawn, the dawn that would carry them into their final flight. The plan bore a name that sounded deceptively solid: Bodenplatte, base plate. It was meant to be the foundation for one last reversal, the plate upon which Germany would rebuild its air dominance. In reality, it was the scaffolding of collapse. General Adolf Galland, once the youthful hero of the Luftwaffe, studied the maps in disbelief. The Allies had over 4,000 aircraft deployed across Western Europe. Germany could barely summon 1,000 fighters fit for flight. Yet the order was signed by Goering himself, the same man who had once promised Hitler that not a single enemy bomb would fall on Berlin. His voice, trembling with fatigue and morphine, declared that the New Year's attack would strike terror into the enemy's heart. Few believed him anymore. In headquarters, scattered across the Reich, staff officers traced flight paths with trembling pencils. Each unit was assigned a specific Allied base: Eindhoven, Brussels, Asch, St. Trond. The instructions were ambitious and fatally rigid: fly low, strike at first light, destroy every aircraft on the ground. No radios, no flares, no second wave. Every squadron would attack simultaneously, guided only by timing and faith.
If timing fails,
but timing in war is a fragile thing. The Luftwaffe no longer possessed radar coordination or reliable communication. Navigation maps were outdated. Fog forecasts were uncertain. Many pilots, barely out of training, had never flown outside Germany. To them, the Netherlands and Belgium were just names on smudged paper. Their instructors whispered the same warning before takeoff: if you lose sight of your leader, you are already dead. Fuel was so scarce that some fighters were loaded with just enough for a round trip, if no mistakes were made. Mechanics scavenged spark plugs from wrecks. Tires were patched with strips of canvas. One officer compared the squadrons to a museum of ghosts painted fresh for battle. Still, the illusion of purpose gave shape to despair. When midnight came, flight leaders gathered their men in hangars lit by single bulbs. They spoke of duty, of defending the fatherland, of the new year, that would begin in victory.
We flew so the next
But behind the
generation could
words
walk in
lay
peace.
silence. Everyone knew this was the last roll of the dice. Outside, frost glistened on the wings of Bf-109s and FW-190s like a funeral sheen. Engines coughed in the cold. Mechanics saluted. And as the eastern horizon began to pale, the first fighters roared into the air, black silhouettes rising into a grey dawn, carrying with them the last hope of a dying empire. The last night of 1944 came cold and breathless across occupied Europe. At airfields from Köln to Darmstadt, the snow creaked under boots as young men walked between rows of waiting fighters, dull grey shapes half buried in frost. The hangars smelled of burnt oil and cheap tobacco, the scent of an air force living on memory. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Allied searchlights swept the clouds, white blades cutting the dark. Inside one small hut at the edge of the Riem Air Base near Munich, Oberleutnant Lothar Wolff sat alone with a chipped mug of coffee gone cold. 23 years old, with the narrow face of a boy who had aged too quickly, Wolff had survived 30 missions, enough to know what survival meant: luck and silence. Around him, his pilots laughed too loudly, their voices brittle with fear. Someone had found an accordion. The tune was cheerful, but every note seemed to echo from a hollow chest. Pinned to the wall was the flight roster for the morning: JG4, target unknown to the young men who would fly. They were told only this: attack enemy airfields at low level, destroy aircraft on the ground, return immediately. No mention of the Allied anti-aircraft belts, or that the route would cross their own front lines, where German flak batteries waited with itchy fingers and fogged scopes. At 2300 hours, a briefing officer entered, his breath visible in the freezing air. He read the orders like a prayer from a dying book. Take off 0700, no radio contact, formation to follow the lead aircraft. Do not engage enemy fighters unless attacked. He hesitated before the final line. Success of this mission will determine the fate of the fatherland. No one applauded. One of the mechanics handed out small envelopes, Feldpost, the soldiers' last letters home, to be mailed if the pilots did not return. Each man folded his note and placed it under his seat cushion, as tradition demanded. Wolff wrote nothing. He had no one left to write to. Outside, the engines idled, their vibrations rolling through the ground like the heartbeat of a dying giant. The propellers carved faint halos in the fog. In the distance, faint flashes marked the Ardennes front, a reminder that the war was still burning, even as the air froze. Near the Belgian border, at Saint-Trond, another world prepared unknowingly for impact. American crews celebrated New Year's Eve with coffee and laughter, their planes lined neatly on the frost-covered runway. Among them was Lieutenant Ed Catrell of the 48th Fighter Squadron, the Grim Reapers. He had been on alert duty since midnight, boots propped on the edge of his P-47 Thunderbolt's wheel, watching the horizon pale over the tree line. When he exhaled, the vapor hung like a ghost between him and the dawn. Far to the east, the German pilots were strapping in. Wolff glanced once at the horizon, a thin, bloodless line of light, and whispered to no one. For the last time. The ground crew pulled away the chocks. The throttle eased forward. The aircraft lurched, shuddered, and began to roll. And thus, as the first sun of 1945 rose over Europe, the Luftwaffe took flight for its final battle. The dawn of January 1st, 1945, rose blood orange over the Ardennes, painting the frost in metallic light. The air was brittle, the kind of cold that made steel groan. Over 200 German fighters, Messerschmitts and Fokker-Wulfs, roared westward in staggered waves, engines howling like a single wounded animal. From the ground, they looked like black arrows drawn against the sun. They flew low, so low that treetops brushed their bellies, frost-laden branches splintering in their wake. Condensation trails hung briefly in the air, then vanished. For the pilots, the world was reduced to vibration and noise. The whine of engines at full throttle, the pulse of adrenaline behind the eyes, the taste of oil seeping into the oxygen mask. Beneath them, the frozen rivers of Belgium and Holland flashed silver, winding through villages still asleep under occupation. Then came the first mistake. As the formation of JG4 crossed the front line, the silhouettes of their FW-190s appeared suddenly on German radar screens. Anti-aircraft crews, unaware of any friendly operation, opened fire. In seconds, the sky erupted in black bursts. Tracer rounds streaked upward, friendly fire from the fatherland itself. 2 aircraft exploded instantly, turning into fragments that vanished into smoke. Another veered sharply and disintegrated against the tree line. Pilots shouted into dead radios. The orders forbidding communication now became their death sentence. The formation broke apart. Without their leader, lost somewhere in the chaos, JG4 drifted west, off course, toward the wrong target. They were supposed to strike Ash Airfield. Instead, guided by desperate guesswork and failing compasses, they descended upon St. Trond, Belgium. At that moment, Lieutenant Ed Catrell was standing beside his P-47 Thunderbolt on runway alert, a cup of steaming coffee in hand. The sky above was pale and quiet, the kind of stillness that makes men forget the world is at war. Then, from the north, he heard it, an unnatural chorus of engines, growing louder, faster, closer. He looked up. The sound came low and fast, like a swarm of hornets tearing through the air. In the next heartbeat, the horizon erupted. The first FW-190s streaked over the trees, guns already flashing. Bullets ripped across the runway. Fuel trucks burst like fireballs. A parked Thunderbolt disintegrated under a direct hit, scattering metal and flame. Ground crews scattered in panic, some diving beneath sandbags, others frozen in disbelief. Catrell dropped his cup, threw himself toward a drainage ditch, and felt the concussion of explosions roll over him like heat from a furnace. Above, the German fighters wheeled back for a second pass. Their tracer rounds cut red lines through the smoke, the air filled with the scream of ricochets and tearing metal. But something was wrong, fatally wrong. Several of the German aircraft still carried their external fuel tanks. They had forgotten to drop them before attack. As they dove, the tanks tore loose, spilled gasoline, and ignited mid-air. One plane became a falling torch, spiraling into the edge of the airfield. Anti-aircraft gunners of the 48th Fighter Group regained composure with mechanical precision. Machine guns barked from sandbag nests. Shells detonated in perfect rhythm, as if the chaos itself had found a heartbeat. A Messerschmitt tried to climb and was hit squarely under the wing root. It disintegrated in a blinding flash. Another came apart just above the runway, fragments clattering across the frozen ground. Catrell, pressed into the mud, saw one Me-109 tumble toward him, so close he could see the pilot's face behind the canopy. Impossibly young, no more than 17. The aircraft struck the ground 30 yards away. The canopy blew apart. The pilot flung half out, eyes wide with terror. For an instant, their gazes met. 2 enemies joined by shock, not hatred, before fire consumed the wreckage and the face was gone. By the time the smoke cleared, 14 of the 16 German aircraft that had attacked St. Trond were gone. 2 limped away toward the east. One of them was Lothar Wolf, his engine coughing black smoke, fuel gauges dropping towards zero. He would be the only one to make it home. Behind him, the wreckage of Operation Bodenplatte still burned on the snow, the sky filled with drifting ash. When the smoke thinned and the gunfire faded, the air over Belgium hung silent, thick with the scent of oil, cordite, and thawing frost. By mid-morning, the full scale of the disaster began to take shape across the Western Front. What had been conceived as a single, coordinated strike, an operation to cripple Allied air power, had dissolved into chaos and ruin within hours. Across dozens of airfields from Brussels to Eindhoven, the same pattern repeated itself. German formations arrived late, scattered, disoriented. Many attacked the wrong targets. Some never arrived at all, their wreckage found later in fields of frozen wheat or tangled among the burned remains of pine forests. Nearly 1/4 of all aircraft lost that day had been shot down by their own anti-aircraft guns before even reaching enemy lines. The survivors of JG4 trickled back to base at Riem in ones and twos, their faces grey beneath the frost and oil streaks. Ground crews counted the empty dispersal bays, marking each absent pilot in silence. Of the 16 that had taken off for St. Trond, only 2 returned. When Oberleutnant Lothar Wolf stepped out of his FW-190, the landing gear splintered beneath him. He collapsed beside the shattered fuselage and wept, not from pain, but from understanding. The Luftwaffe he had once believed eternal no longer existed. What had returned from the skies was not an air force, but its ghost. Elsewhere, the cost was equally catastrophic. In a single morning, nearly 300 German fighters had been destroyed, more than half of them on enemy soil, the rest in friendly territory. 143 pilots were killed or missing. 70 more were captured, many after crash landing behind Allied lines. These were not machines that Germany could afford to lose, but more critically, they were men, trained pilots, the last veterans of a dying breed. Unlike aircraft, they could not be replaced. The Allies, stunned at first by the audacity of the attack, quickly grasped its true meaning. The raid had inflicted damage, roughly 200 aircraft destroyed on the ground, but most were repairable within days. By January 5th, Allied air power over Western Europe had not diminished, it had grown. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, had gutted itself beyond recovery. In London, intelligence officers studying the after-action reports noted the irony. The Luftwaffe's final offensive had achieved exactly the opposite of what it intended. Instead of blinding the Allies, it had extinguished Germany's own eyes in the sky. At Allied headquarters in Belgium, American officers were less analytical. One of them, after walking through the wreckage of St. Trond, simply muttered, "They threw their last sons at us." And in a sense, they had. The photographs taken that day, twisted wrecks of Messerschmitts, the charred outlines of Focke-Wulfs on snow, would become the last group portrait of the Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe's skies, now reduced to cinders under the indifferent light of a January sun. When the morning quiet finally settled over St. Trond, Lieutenant Ed Catrell climbed out of the drainage ditch that had saved his life. The air was heavy with the acrid sweetness of burnt aviation fuel, the ground littered with shell casings and fragments of men's ambitions. Smoke still curled from the carcasses of FW-190s strewn across the frozen field. Somewhere amid the wreckage, a propeller still spun, whining slowly to a stop. Catrell walked with the cautious disbelief of someone stepping out of a nightmare. His boots crunched over shattered perspex and splintered aluminum. He paused beside what remained of a Messerschmitt, its wings folded like paper, the tail half buried in the mud. The pilot's helmet lay nearby, scorched, small, the leather still soft. He knelt, touched it, and realized it could have belonged to a boy. All around him, his comrades were emerging from hangars and craters, shouting, counting, cursing. Mechanics doused fires with sand and foam. A medic ran past, dragging a wounded German pilot on a tarp. The man's uniform was torn open, and beneath the grime, Catrell could see the insignia, a Luftwaffe eagle still glinting faintly in the light. Someone handed Catrell a rifle, but he didn't take it. He only watched as the German gasped, his lips moving around words no one could understand. For a moment, Cottrell thought of the pilot he had seen die during the attack, the young face framed in flame, eyes wide, uncomprehending. That image, he would later say, never went away. I kept seeing that face every time I looked into the mirror of my canopy. By the afternoon, the 48th Fighter Group was operational again. Crews worked with the efficiency of men too tired to feel. Damaged aircraft were towed aside, new ammunition loaded, orders relayed for afternoon patrols. War had no pause button. But something had changed in Cottrell. The celebration of New Year's Eve, the jokes, the confidence, all of it had evaporated. He felt as though time itself had skipped forward. The men who had survived the raid moved quietly now, each one aware that survival was not victory, only delay. A few days later, word reached the base that Ted Smith, Cottrell's roommate and wingman, had been shot down over Germany. His Thunderbolt had gone down in flames near the Rhine. There was no parachute sighted. Cottrell stood in front of his cot that night, staring at Smith's empty bed, the photograph of Smith's wife and daughter still pinned above it. He said nothing. He simply walked out to the airstrip, stood beside his own plane, and traced his fingers along the name he had painted on its nose. Feet of Heaven. The name had come from his newborn daughter, the one he had never met, whose footprints were stenciled beneath the cockpit glass. In the frozen reflection of the canopy, he saw those faint prints mirrored against the vast sky, like a promise to something beyond the war. He would fly with that plane until the end of the conflict, through the thunder of Germany's collapse and into the pale peace of 1945. When the guns finally fell silent, he did not cheer. He only sat on the wing of his Thunderbolt and looked west, where the sun was sinking over France, its light sliding across the ruined fields. He knew what the enemy pilots had felt: fear, hope, exhaustion, and the strange, shared desire to live just one more day. In that, there were no sides left, only men and the endless sky. History would remember Operation Bodenplatte not as a triumph of audacity, but as the final, futile heartbeat of an empire that had forgotten how to breathe. In the official German communiques of January 1945, the attack was described as a successful surprise against enemy airfields. The truth, however, was written in wreckage. Within 24 hours, Allied reconnaissance photographs revealed the devastation, not of Allied installations, but of Luftwaffe squadrons themselves. Airfields across the Reich lay littered with burned-out fighters, their shadows frozen into the snow like gravestones. For decades afterward, historians would trace the anatomy of that failure. They would study the tactical blunders, the absence of radio coordination, the misidentification of targets, the disastrous friendly fire. They would debate whether Goering's headquarters had ever grasped the reality of the Luftwaffe's decline. But beyond analysis and charts lay a deeper, quieter revelation, one that could not be measured in sorties or statistics. Bodenplatte marked the moment when Germany's air war died not from lack of courage, but from the collapse of time itself. The young men who flew that morning were not the heirs of the Battle of Britain aces. They were their echoes. Trained too quickly, sent too soon, they were fighting a war their leaders had already lost, but could not yet admit was over. The Luftwaffe's tragedy was not that it fell. It was that it fell believing it could still rise. In contrast, the Allies learned the opposite lesson, that superiority in the air was not born from heroism alone, but from the relentless machinery of endurance. Fuel, training, logistics, radar networks, communication, these invisible arteries sustained the Allied body long after the Luftwaffes had gone cold. When Bodenplatte burned, it illuminated the brutal arithmetic of modern war. Machines can be built, but men must be raised. For the pilots who survived, the war would never truly end. Many of them would fly again in civilian skies, carrying passengers instead of guns. Yet each time they passed through clouds, they would glimpse, if only for a moment, the ghosts of that New Year's morning. A flicker of sunlight on metal, the echo of engines fading into frost. In every air museum that would later display a Messerschmitt or a Thunderbolt, the curators would write of horsepower and speed, climb rates and calibers. But history itself would whisper something simpler. Courage without clarity becomes sacrifice. And Bodenplatte had been the ultimate sacrifice, not of a nation's enemies, but of its own sons. When night returned over Europe that first day of 1945, the snow began to fall again. Slow, indifferent, unhurried. It covered the burned airfields and the broken wings, the oil-stained ground and the faces of the dead. In that white silence, the war's machinery seemed to fade, leaving only the echo of men who had believed the sky could save them. The Luftwaffe never rose again. In the weeks that followed, the Allies crossed the Rhine. The Reich collapsed into its own shadow. Yet somewhere in that frozen air still lingered the vibration of engines, the heartbeat of those who flew into the impossible dawn. It is said that every empire ends twice, first in defeat and then in memory. On January 1st, 1945, the Luftwaffe met both fates at once. The first, when its last fighters fell flaming into the snow, and the second, when no one heard them coming. The sky does not remember who ruled it, only who vanished into it.